So, I've covered a lot of different characters on this channel. But there has been a glaring absence from my lineup so far. Yes, today's the day everybody's favorite webhead gets the time to shine on Comics Are Awesome. Will it be something from the classic Lee Ditko era? Or something, more recent, from Nick Spencer's run? Yeah, if you clicked on this video, you probably did it because of how infamous this comic is. In that case, well, subscribe first if you're new. And yes, this is indeed the comic where Mary Jane dies because of Peter's... Okay, but is there anything else to it? Well, let's find out together. Grab a coffee and a bottle of brain bleach. Here's Spider-Man Reign. The story opens with a fake-out that nobody who's heard of this comic will fall for, as a young couple resembling Peter and MJ leave a flower shop where we find an old Peter is now working. Or was working, as he gets fired for not getting the couple's order right. We see what the world is like now, as New York is now a fascist state after Peter retired from being Spidey after Mary Jane died. If that rings a bell in your head, you should probably listen to it, as indeed this is a take on Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, but with Spider-Man instead of Batman. I'll save my thoughts on what I think about the premise later. I'll just quickly summarize the plot. New York is in a protective shield called the Web. The media and the police are in the pockets of the mayor, who plans on expanding the Web's influence further. J. Jonah Jameson shows up and gives Peter a Spider-Man mask, having figured out who he was and asking him to return to action. Peter initially refuses, but after seeing JJ get beat up by a bunch of cops, he decides to put the mask back on. On hearing of Spider-Man's return, the mayor decides to send a bunch of Spidey's old villains to go get him. In the fight, Peter gets overpowered and is about to be killed when what appears to be Doc Ock grabs him and takes him to Mary Jane's grave. After the scene for which this book will live on in infamy takes place, Peter gets his heroic second win and casually murders most of the Sinner Six. That's what they're called in this book. Before confronting the real evil behind all this, the mayor's assistant, Edward Sachs. Who? It's revealed that Sachs is actually Venom, who plans to use the Web to infect everyone in New York with symbiotes. Spider-Man nearly loses the fight, but Sandman shows up and gives him a detonator to the bomb in him, which Peter uses to blow up both Sandman and Venom, saving the day. The story ends with Peter continuing to fight crime as Spider-Man, while telling MJ that one day he'll return to her. Before I talk about the infamous scene involving Mary Jane and Peter's webbing, yeah, let's go with that, let's analyze the plot a bit. By that I mean, let's see how much this book homages Dark Knight Returns. Commentary on how the media runs our lives and how those who hold political office are ineffective? Check. An old villain of the retired hero acting like a jilted lover? Check. The old hero choosing to retire after a loved one died? I mean, yeah, that was fairly obvious. Even the art looks like it's trying to replicate Frank Miller's style. And not doing a good job, frankly, pun intended, speaking. However, there are things that could work here if given a bit more attention. I like J. Jonah Jameson using his ability to get under everyone's skin to propel the plot along, and honestly, he feels like the actual protagonist most of the time. Sandman and his daughter, that's introduced in this series, also form a strong emotional core for the story to center itself around. But the biggest issue of this story, no, not that, but I will be getting to it really soon, just wait a teensy bit more, is Peter himself. While it is possible that Spider-Man might not be a great fit for a DKR type of story, given how much angst, or wanks, depending on who you're asking, Peter Parker goes through on a regular basis, I think there might have been a story here. sadly, that's not what we get. As while we get some good old Peter Parker angst, yay, the minute he puts the mask back on, it's gone. No angst, no issues with using his powers, despite not having used them for a long time. He's back to quipping away like he used to. And while some of you might say maybe he's just using humor to deflect his pain, no, I don't buy it. This story relies a bit too much on shock value for anything that new. Speaking of which, it's time. Let's talk about that scene. And I'll actually describe the entire thing in detail so you get what I mean by the story using shock value. So remember me talking about Doc Ock's tentacles carrying Peter to the graveyard where MJ was buried? Well, it turns out the tentacles were programmed to do so by the good doctor after his death if Spider-Man was to ever return. And they did do that, while still being attached to the decaying corpse of Otto Octavius. And then they proceed to bury Peter alive in Mary Jane's coffin, all to give Peter his mojo back. And then we see Peter describe how Mary Jane died from his radioactivity. And it's just not as the song says. Apparently, all of Peter's fluids were radioactive. And by loving him, Mary Jane was... oh God. See what I mean by shock value? In case some of you think I'm being a prude or something like that, let me ask you. What was the story reason behind Mary Jane's death by webbing? Please sound off in the comments on your thoughts. I'll give you my reason. This story, at least the way the final product ended up, would be barely remembered. A footnote in Spidey's history. But by doing this, at least everyone will remember the story in which Mary Jane died from radiation poisoning caused by Peter's fluids. And for final thoughts, I'd like to back up my hypothesis by pointing out that the first issue of Spider-Man Reign was recalled because it decided to show off Peter's web shooter. Yeah. Spider-Man does whatever a spider can, spins his web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out! Here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud. He's got radioactive